Wednesday, and there are lots of events. So just to say, first of all, is that the meeting is being recorded. If there is a problem that anybody has, we can kind of take you out, I think, of the pictures, but it'll be the verbal that is being recorded. Could I very much welcome Kasia Narkowicz, who is my new colleague and at Middlesex University, and Kasia has just joined this year and is a lecturer in criminology. And she will speak today on the topic of Brexit, COVID, and the hierarchies of Europeanness, Polish migrants in the UK, which is a rather, you could say, a pressing topic and of the moment. Her PhD, in fact, explored conflicts around race, religion, and gender in the public sphere in Poland. And in fact, again, some of you may have seen that yesterday the Swiss voted for a burqa ban, which joins, I'm just writing about it at the moment on the headscarf affair in Europe, which joins the burqa ban in a number of other countries. So the whole question I want to say of race, religion, and gender is in the public sphere is extremely important. Kasia has also currently is involved in a project, an ESRC project funded by them called Health, Social, Economic and Cultural Impacts of COVID-19 on Migrant Essential Workers in the UK. And again, she's looking at the impact of COVID on Polish essential workers. And lastly, again, on the Central and Eastern European front, she's one of the three co-founders of what's called Post-CEE, which is looking at the post-independence geographies in Central and Eastern Europe, which is a network of scholars, and it's funded by the Regional Studies Association as of 2020. So that's my introduction to Kasia, so very welcome. And if you'd like to present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions. The other thing is, if you'd like to post in the chat, we will be following that. But if you have a problem or you want to just raise your hand, and hopefully we will pick up, there's myself and Cecilia Pazaniti Mazzano who will pick up the questions as well. So both of us will be looking out for questions posted up and hands up. Okay, so Kasia, over to you and very welcome.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many people who I know or know of. So what I'll be doing today is talking about a project that I finished, I want to say last year, but it was 2020 because it feels like it was last year, pre-pandemic. I just finished interviews with Polish people, mainly in London. And I'm just going through them now. So I'm analyzing them, and I'm going to present to you some quotes. So this is going to be quite an empirical talk. And because so many people work in this field that are here today, it would be really nice to hear your feedback, any comments and questions. And then in the last few minutes of the talk, I'm going to just kind of introduce the new project that is looking at COVID and Polish essential workers in the context of COVID. So we've just kind of started this project. Okay, so just for people who are, I mean, most of you are aware of all this, but just for those who are not, the larger migration to the UK of Polish people started sort of after the 2004 Eastern enlargement of the European Union. As of the 2011 census, Polish is the second most spoken language in this country. And when it comes to the foreign-born population in the UK, Poles were the biggest one. In 2007, they reached 1 million in terms of numbers. Today, it is more towards 815,000, and we have observed a drop. So if you see on in the chart to the right at the bottom, 2019, it was much higher. So we have observed something in the last year or so. It's quite a significant drop. So just to give you a little bit more of a context, so situate this talk. So migration generally is from Eastern Europe to Western Europe rather than the other way around. and Poland joined in 2004, and then 2007 we saw 2 more countries, Bulgaria and Romania, join the EU, and there was subsequently more Eastern European migration from there. And as colleagues Eleanor, Alessio have and many others have done this work already, talking about how Eastern European migrants are less likely to have a degree, those who come to this country, than Western European migrants, more likely to suffer de-skilling as well as working for lower wages. Holmwood and Bamra have situated this migration in the context of continuation of the British economy post-empire. So at the same time as rights in terms of immigration law were limited to previous citizens from previously colonized countries. So at the same time as that migration was restricted, so-called paler migrants from Eastern Europe were allowed in to sort of keep that economy going. So there is that tension there that is worth to sort of think about. At the same time as they were European migrants coming in, there was also racialization of them, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. So being sort of European, but not quite. Okay, and it is this in-betweenness that I think it's quite interesting, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, and this is part of sort of wider context of positioning and thinking about Eastern Europe in a context of global coloniality of power. So there's a lot of scholars, and I just put some of the names there, but in the last few years there has been really a shift, or not a shift, but a development of thinking decolonially about Eastern Europe. So post and decolonial debates or that literature have been sort of employed to think about Eastern Europe in complex ways. And it's really great to see that this field is developing, and I kind of situate myself in that in those decolonial debates on Eastern Europe. Okay, and if we just think historically, racialization of Eastern Europe or Eastern Europeans have a long history. I'm not a historian, so again, I'm popping some names at the bottom of the screen for people who are interested in this. These are colleagues who do much more nuanced work about the historical aspect of this. But generally, just to make that point that, the East, Slavic East, has been historically narrated as being, less developed, more primitive, as an empty space, not having history, not being part of the real Europe, the Europe that counts. And then people who live in those regions, so Slavs or Eastern Europeans, considered by even people like Hegel, maybe not even, but people like Hegel, as to be excluded from sort of our consideration, because they don't really contribute anything apart from being sort of subordinate or antagonistic. So Eastern Europe has historically been this territory of others, right, while still in Europe. And I want to show you this picture. So this picture is from the BBC. It's a BBC article from 2003. So this is just when Poland voted to a big yes to join the EU. Actually, many people participated in this in the voting there. So it was an enthusiastic yes. And I want to put your attention to particularly to the image of the babushka-like figure, because it is representing a form of continuity of these historical narratives that we have seen and we continue to see, right? Of this kind of stubborn portrayal of Eastern Europe as being static, with this figure representing a Poland that is, so eager and so in need to sort of be more developed, to catch up, right? This catching up narratives with Europe and to shed its kind of backward identity, right? And you won't see it maybe because at the bottom the text is a bit cut, but the then president of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, said that this is a return to the European family. And this word, the choose of the word is interesting here, the return, because it also links to the whole idea of Central and Eastern Europe as being closer to Europe, as having been cut off unfairly, and is closer to Europe, to Western Europe than to Eastern Europe. So there's this whole complex kind of set of narratives around where we belong. But I remember also, just to kind of situate myself in this work that I do, I migrated from Poland when I was a child. I was 10 years old, and I migrated to Sweden. And I remember growing up in Sweden, every time there was elections in Poland, I remember seeing images of a Poland that I did not know. There was not a Poland that I sort of visited or I knew of. And it was often, I remember particularly a couple of times there was, a man sitting with like driving horse and carts. And I thought it's interesting because I never see these narratives, but these are these images are the only thing that Swedish people see when Poland is coming on the news, every few years when it's time for elections. And maybe these images have changed, have been nuanced, but we still have those catching up narratives and we still have those tensions around there. And what I'm trying to say with this is that those realities and those representations actually do impact the way that Polish people navigate their space, the space here when they come as migrants and to other Western European countries, and that there is a certain sort of tension and complexity within that has a long history. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you today is about these hierarchies of Europeanness or hierarchies of whiteness and the in-betweenness of Eastern Europeans, particularly Polish people. So in the first part, we'll talk about the sense of exclusion of Polish people and kind of linking it to wider Eastern European group. So the exclusion when they are not white enough and can be excluded and racialized. And then secondly, when they are white enough, in the sense that when Polish people can draw on racist narratives to exclude others, right? People who are considered, who are racialized as well. Okay, so there's this kind of in-betweenness that I will show. So starting, just to tell you a little bit maybe about the data quickly. So this was interviews that I did together with Kasia Bodek, my research associate, and we did 20 interviews, largely kind of split between men and women. And you will see here, there's quite a diversity in terms of ages, when people migrated, and also the profession, so what sort of things they worked with. And both of us, me and Kasia, are Polish migrants and we are Polish speakers. So most of the interviews, I think, apart from one or two, were in Polish. Okay, so let me start bringing you a whole wealth of quotes. It's a lot of slides, but hopefully it won't be boring because I'll try and read them out. So thinking about when Polish people talked about being racialized. So this is Ryszard, who has been in this country for quite a long time. He lives in London. And he talks about, quite critically about racism. He says, there's racism here, and Poles will always feel like second category citizens. It's the same with how they treat the Pakistanis or other immigrants. They always feel like they are the world's masters, and they don't seem to have realized that the British Empire collapsed a while back. And I will return to Ryszard at the end of the presentation. So just kind of remember him and what he says here when he expresses some form of solidarity with other racialized migrants and is quite critical of the racism and sort of places himself more on the side of the racialized migrants that experience racism, right? Than the Brits. And then we have Amelia, who is quite young, and she arrived as a child to the UK and initially lived in north of England and is now in London. So she talks about what happens when she goes back to Poland, and she visits Poland frequently, and when she meets new people, and she says, my friends would sort of introduce me like, this is Amelia, she's from England. And then she says the reaction often is that people have a certain attitude towards her. So they say like, oh, she thinks she's better than everybody else. Maybe they're jealous, she thinks, right? So this is to say that actually coming from England to Poland means that there's certain capital she comes with, of course, but there's also certain idea that it is a good thing, maybe an aspiring thing to come from England. People might be jealous because I come from England. And then she said, next, and when I tell English people that I'm Polish, they're like, oh my God, that's so fun. And they start to say something funny about a stereotype. Like there was this whole stereotype that Polish people eat swans, right? And this links to research that colleagues have done about this idea that sort of travels through different groups, starting like with Roma, like swan skewing Roma people, and then kind of travels to Hungarians and Bulgarians, or Bulgarians more, I think, and then somehow to Polish people as well. right? And what that work that does is that it connects migrants to sort of uncivilized activities and puts into question the civilizational credentials, right, of migrants, Eastern European migrants. And again, Amelia here saying back then, so she talks about sort of when she was growing up, it was still very horrible for Polish people to be here. Obviously, it still is now because people still hate us in a way as a nation in England. But like back then, it was harsh stuff. Nobody wanted Polish people to come. So it was very traumatizing to go from a nice place to like, you're in another country. It was very much like, you know, the whole old joke that they're stealing our jobs, can't speak English. Okay, and language and Englishness was quite prominent in the interviews. Like everybody spoke about that in different ways, but similar in some ways we'll see next. So again, Janusz here has been in this country quite a long time, and he has children that speak English very well. I asked him, you know, do you feel comfortable speaking in Polish in public? And he said that he actually tries to speak Polish in public because of his kids, because he wants his kids to speak Polish. But then he says, it kind of depends, I don't know. I feel like I'm not sure how to explain it. I don't think people have positive association with it. If it's on a train, in the restaurant or wherever, I think people respond negatively to it. And then we have Grażyna, who took the stance that actually she does not speak Polish in public. And she was interviewed by my colleague Kasia and said to her, you know, in public places, like now it's okay that we speak Polish because the interview was in Polish, because I still make a lot of mistakes in English. So I guess she didn't want to come across as sort of not speaking fluent English. But generally, and with my kids, we try to speak English so that people who are around us won't feel uncomfortable with our Polish language. And, you know, also some of my friends have experiences with people telling them off for speaking Polish. And strangely, it is often older Brits. And then Amelia, again, reflecting on her school years when she was a child. So she said, I remember at school where the Polish kids used to get targeted quite a bit. Like I remember there being one time where people got called in after school for like a meeting with a teacher to tell them off. And I swear it was literally just Polish kids. It was a problem because they were hanging around in groups, and it was like, oh, you're all like in a group and you're intimidating. And it's like, don't do that, or like, don't speak Polish around English people because they can't understand what you're saying. It felt very targeted. So colleagues have talked about the language as being sort of something that you conceal. So you conceal your Polishness because whether it is through language or other things like clothing, because it comes with embarrassment. Okay, and particularly if your English is not fluent, if you have an accent, for example, and here it's important to note that it's an Eastern European accent that is seen as lesser good than other accents. So if you have an accent, if you make a mistake, it is seen as a humiliation. It is a humiliating thing. Daria Krivonos has done work on Russian migrants in Finland, talking about sort of attempts to pass as white through not speaking your language in public spaces, or even changing your address and your names. And this links to what Alina Rzepnikowska has written about as markers such as language, speaking Polish, having a differently sounding name or clothing that is maybe seen as unfashionable, serve to differentiate and racialize Eastern Europeans despite their shared whiteness. So again, here, this shared whiteness is sort of comes and goes, right? So you pass as white and sometimes you don't, okay? And you might remember at the end of 2019, when it was an election in this country, and Boris Johnson said that EU migrants have been able to treat the UK as if it's part of their own country for too long, okay? And that caused a lot of, understandably, that caused a lot of upset among EU migrants who reacted who reacted and said things like Make Born from the 3 Million group, who said that Boris Johnson thinks I have been able to treat the UK as if it is part of my own country for too long. My own country, that would be Germany, which I left 26 years ago. I came as what he now calls an unskilled migrant, attracted by a love for British literature, culture, and its university system. Another journalist talked about her Italian husband as feeling very much as part of his own country, and said, how dare Boris Johnson say these things when, you know, My husband has bought a house, pays taxes, has made friends, contributes to the community, and is very much feeling part of this country, right? So there are these narratives of maybe more Western European migrants that did not necessarily come through in the interviews that I did with Polish migrants that did not express, or rather expressed, attention and insecurity and a sense of not being at home. They might have been attracted by British literature or culture or university system, but it didn't mean that they were able to symbolically or materially have a home, for example, in this country. So this is some data about sense of belonging and sense of home. And this is what Grażyna is saying. She says, I go to Poland twice a year for a few days, but I don't feel at home there. But the whole situation with Brexit made me feel that I don't feel at home here either. It's sad. I'm scared that my children might be marginalized because of where they came from, where they come from. I'm scared what will happen after Brexit. Michał says, I have the issue of feeling a bit torn because I'm always thinking about Poland, and here, well, I don't have a home. I'm renting a room for now. I won't be able to buy anything, so it just won't be my home, simply. I'm not sure if I could have a better life elsewhere, but I don't feel fully at home. And Maya, who has been in this country for quite a long time, says migration isn't all that wonderful. It's hard to start a life here. The living standards here are pretty bleak. And if you want to buy a property, there's no guarantee you'll be accepted for a mortgage because banks make it difficult. We wanted to buy a house 3 years ago and nothing came of it. If I could afford to buy my own house here, I don't think I'd return to Poland, but we need somewhere to live when we retired. So of course, all of them associated this kind of feeling at home with house ownership. So of course, they still had somewhere to live. It was just impossible to think about sort of settling down because it was often renting rooms or houses that were maybe not sort of satisfactory in terms of what they expected for a standard of living. And then some kind of specific sort of examples of being targeted post-Brexit. Marek says that he was a football coach, and several occasions they had some issues right after Brexit with the people who they played football with. He says maybe it wasn't as much a discrimination towards us, but often we would play games, and often it would be the case that the English would lose, and then they would go on about Brexit, like, okay, boys, soon you will go back home. And he said often that led to fights, and the relations kind of soured after that. And Agata, and this actually often happened when I asked, and when Kasia asked people, have you experienced discrimination? Have you experienced racism? Sort of in the context of Brexit, people would say, no, not really. But then in the next sentence, they would say, but I know some friends, or this one thing happened. So it would often come sort of as an afterthought. So Agata says, I don't feel prejudice. Only once, straight after the referendum, when I was sitting on the bus going to work, and a man came on and asked me if I had bought suitcases yet. So as Luc de Noronha said, Eastern Europeans occupy a more hybrid space of this in-betweenness. So they are not quite white enough to feel offended by Brexit and increasingly hostile border regimes, but privileged enough to have time to pack their own bags and be granted indefinite leave to remain. Okay, so again, speaking to this in-betweenness. Okay, so now I'm gonna swap over from feeling racialized and experiencing this prejudice because of one's Eastern Europeanness and not being enough of a European or not being white enough, to instances where people actually engage in racist narratives against others, okay, when they somehow their whiteness afforded them that. So Agata said, so Agata works as a cleaner, and she actually has a Muslim boyfriend, but she says he's not very Muslim. So he's kind of liberal, she said. So she says, I'm not sure why, but I had this one experience cleaning for a Muslim family, and they asked me to work more hours, but somehow I didn't want to. It was just after the attacks in London, I think, and this woman terrified me. I feel inside that I just don't want to work for Muslims, and that's it. Rishad, who you might remember from the beginning when he was talking about racism and feeling like him and, say, Pakistani people in this country are experiencing racism similarly, said, generally, I don't have a problem with Muslims. When I see a woman in a scarf with only small slits for the eyes, it just looks a bit funny. I feel a bit unsafe. At the same time, if they decide to live in Western culture, then they should respect our norms and our culture. Okay, so here it's really interesting how he swaps over from the solidarity with being the other of the British Empire and of Britain today, and be experiencing racism, to then quite being able to swift in the same conversation or switch over to talking about our culture, right? And our norms, our Western culture. So his whiteness and his Europeanness afforded him that, right? So there was this kind of contradiction there in his narrative. And then this is, I'm just going to give you two quotes from Carolina before I finish with the narratives. And Carolina, I had a lot from this interview because there was a lot of contradicting narratives in her narrative, in her interview. So she said that she came as an educated person to get a job in London, and she really loved London for being so diverse. So that's what she most loved about it. And she was very critical of people judging people based on their skin color. She was very critical of that her family sometimes used the word chapaty, which is a racial slur in Polish. She was very critical of people saying to her that because she has a Muslim friend, you know, that's kind of dangerous, and her mom warned her to never get involved in a romantic relationship with her Muslim friend because he might kidnap the children or whatever. So she was very critical of that. And then she talked about being in London, but also getting some job offers in Essex. So she says, London seems nice, nicer than anywhere else in the UK. Essex, for example, is so white and full of the English. I would feel weird here. I went to a pub there once and I felt so different. I finally felt like I was in England with the English and that I'm different. Okay, so on the one hand, she finally felt like she was in England because it was more white. But at the same time, she said that that didn't suit her because she felt different, right? So she wouldn't want to be there, actually. She likes London for what it is. And then we talked about the areas where she lived in London, where she had lived. And this is my last quote. She says, my local area in Croydon was pretty rough. There'd always be police sirens, or you'd walk past a crime scene. I wanted to move because there was nothing which made up for its terribleness. Then I lived in Balham, which I think was my favorite. It was full of houses and a really nice high street pubs. It was a little whiter too, but not completely. It was more happening, had more culture. I felt like there was a lesser chance of something happening to me, or when it was the summer, I didn't feel awkward about showing my arms and legs. I felt more comfortable and didn't stick out. I think subconsciously, I feel less comfortable around people who look differently to me. And you hear a lot about it on the news, about stabbings and so forth. It is mainly Black people that do it and their gangs. Even though I felt safer in Balham, crime can happen anywhere. But as a woman, I felt a lot more comfortable there and getting home at night in a whiter neighborhood, right? So this came after sort of a long conversation about how people shouldn't be judged for their skin color. Okay, so I'm gonna finish with this side of the presentation. I have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to talk to you, I want to just summarize first and then talk to you about the other project briefly. So here I just want to summarize by drawing on some debates that colleagues have sort of put forward about Eastern Europeans, you know, being at the centers and at the same time at the margins of the symbolic boundary of whiteness, you know, understanding or taking into consideration the core periphery dynamics, like when we think about Brexit and what happens with Eastern European migrants in this country. And then also acknowledging that, you know, Poland has a long history of being racially excluded, but also engaging in racial exclusion. So, I mean, we have a history of Jewish and Roma violence happening in Poland, right? But also, as Bolaji, who's I think here with us today, has done a great work sort of looking back at Polish colonial ambitions. So the fact that Poland actually had the ambition, even if it was a failed ambition, but had the ambition of having colonies because they wanted to be closer to the, like they wanted to be like Western countries and have those profits. Okay, so still this is really important as that kind of in-betweenness, that dynamic. And then, of course, the continuation of racism and Islamophobia in Poland today that we see sort of never ending. Okay, so just to sort of introduce to you this new project, and we just got funded end of last year. It was this UCRI rapid response grants to deal with COVID. And I'm working with colleagues in Glasgow and in Sheffield, mapping the impacts of COVID on Polish essential workers. And we're working with partners in England and in Scotland, who will, and the project it started in November and will run until May 2022. And some of our research questions, we got 3. The first one is, what are the key impacts of COVID-19 on Polish essential workers? How is COVID affecting migrant essential workers' plan to stay in the UK? And so we know, like I mentioned in the beginning, that people are leaving. We want to sort of get a sense of, you know, is it Brexit, is it COVID, is it both? Which one is it more? What are the reasons? And then thirdly, how can governments and employers in the essential work sector best support and retain migrant workers, sort of particularly thinking of Polish people? And so we are now currently doing a survey. So it's going really well. It's the person who's leading on this is Aneta Piekut from University of Sheffield. From what I hear, we have a good response so far from Polish essential workers. And the next steps are to do expert interviews with our partner organizations and with other experts, and then interview Polish essential workers as well. And lastly, we will work together with our partners to develop a policy toolkit that can sort of inform employers and also sort of policy. And some issues just in the last couple of minutes that I think might be worth thinking about for this project are plans to stay, about Polish migrants and essential workers' plans to stay. I mean, we know that some have left already. I know that some have left maybe temporarily as well. So there's a sense of sort of how permanent is the leaving of this country. There are issues that we know about around shared accommodation. So many people, Polish people and other migrants would share accommodation, right? Sometimes share rooms. And there are issues around sort of overcrowding, but also, you know, being able to pay your rent. I have heard stories about landlords telling Polish migrants that they can pay only half of the rent, but actually pay the rest later on, and this puts them in debt. And especially because people, not all people worked in, or not all their work is registered. So actually there are people who have gone back to Poland to sort of wait it out because they don't have an income now. But there are also people here who still have to pay half the rent, will later have to pay more of the rent, but are not getting an income right now. There are issues, of course, about vaccine uptake. We know that there was research about Poland being one of the countries that where people did not say they want to get vaccinated in as much, in a higher percentage as other countries. And there are also issues around, you know, English skills and sort of trust and ability to sort of get information, etc. Okay. So this is our website. It is both in Polish and in English, and we have a Twitter account, we have Facebook, we have all of that. If you're interested, please get in touch. And with that, my 30 minutes have passed, and just want to thank you, and yeah, welcome any comments, questions that you might have. So thank you so much. I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thanks very much, Kasia, for a very interesting talk on the in-betweenness of Polish migrants and trying to apply a sort of decolonial perspective. So, and then moving on to the beginnings of your current project. So either if you'd like to put your hand up or you'd like to post in chat. At the moment, we have no questions posted in chat. So if anybody would like to raise their hands, if they'd like to pose a question.
Shall I just ask a question then?
Yeah, naturally, go ahead.
So thank you. It was really a wonderful presentation. And I haven't thought about racialization of the Poles in the UK, because in my head they were European. So it's interesting that you highlight that. And I also know of the Polish community in Manchester, the ones who came like 50 years ago, post-war. So I assume because they have been here for such a long time, you wouldn't really experience anything like that. So I wonder whether the participants you talked to had connections with this, like first generation Polish migrants who arrived, and yeah, whether that contributed to them feeling more home, maybe.
Yeah, you're so right. So there is obviously previous waves of migration of Polish people, and there are some people who are very established in this country. The sense that I got, and maybe other people will know more if they have done research on the other waves of migrants, but the people who I spoke to, some came before 2004, not legally, and they were very precarious when they came. They came as like on a tour, like, and then just stayed. But most of them came sort of around 2004 and after that. They did not talk about having relationships with more established Polish people. A couple of them had an aunt or an uncle or a distant cousin that had been in the country for longer that enabled that migration or enabled, housing in the first few months. But generally, there didn't seem to be that much sort of connection and solidarity. And moreover, at least from what our participants said, which really came in, I think most of the interviews, was how they didn't really get on with other Polish people, and how they didn't really get on with other Eastern Europeans, or that Eastern Europeans don't help each other, or Polish people don't help each other. And I think it has come through in other people's work as well, talking about your fellow Poles as not being sort of welcoming, not being trustworthy. And this always struck me because, these people that sat opposite me and were very willing to share their story and always told me, I'll tell you about my friend who will help you, I thought, are we really so awful and unhelpful, or is it a way of like talking about us, as being, like we're all going to steal from each other and all of that. So, but generally there was some kind of tension like in the community at the same time as when I asked, and when Kasia asked, who are your friends, they were mainly other Polish people and people from Eastern European community. So again, like a lot of complexity there.
Can I just respond a little bit before?
Yeah.
We've got 3 questions in the chat. 2 things. Duval and I can't remember who else did a study in about 2001 and 2002, before, when Poles were still, they could come in, but it's before the official enlargement. And they found there was a lot of, and sort of kind of not helping each other. The other thing is Louise Ryan and I, and particularly Louise, did a study. I can't remember when it was exactly. It was exactly on this issue of the relationship between the different Polish communities. So we looked at the recent, we looked at the post-war, and we looked at the post-1981, when quite a few Poles came in the country, at the time of Solidarność. So we did look at the relationship between the different waves in London, at least. Okay, so just to say, we have a question from Camilla, and I'll get, if each person wants to ask their own question. So there's a question from Camilla, Agnieszka, Alex, and Elena. Okay, so Camilla, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wrote the question, and I think I will link it to also Elena's question. If you observed any, hierarchies between the EU migrants, be it A8 and A2. But also I wondered how, and if you observed how gender, plays out in this context, whether it influences the experience of being racialized, but how also this maybe affected how people racialize others. So I wonder if this is something that you came across in your research. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla. So when it came to the A8 migrants, there was expressions of sort of solidarity and feeling like we're all the same, and actually a lot of people mentioning friendships across within the A8 group. But then when it came to the A2 migrants, so like Romanians particularly, less so Hungarians, there was much more distance there, even though some people did talk about that, it's so unfortunate because people in this country think that all Romanians are Roma, but they're not. So that's why we can be friends with them, So again, this kind of racialization of Roma. And actually, I didn't talk about this, but there was a lot of instances of racism towards Roma in the interviews, as well as a little bit of anti-Semitism, even if it was sort of lesser than towards Roma. So on the one hand, it was sort of, oh, English people don't realize that all Romanians are not Roma, so they're okay. But at the same time, there was a little bit of distance, and people often had experiences with Roma people renting housing to them, and they were sort of not happy with the way they were treated, etc. So very racialized narratives actually that came through. The gender lens, no. I didn't look at the gender lens, and I haven't analyzed it yet, but I think it would be interesting to analyze that as I go through. But for now, I can't really tell you anything because I don't think it will be sort of true to what I've done so far. But I'll share, when I figure something out, I'll share it with you.
Okay, next question, Agnieszka.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kasia, for your presentation. So I have two questions. So you say about this, and also in the title of the seminar, about the hierarchies of Europeanness. So I wonder if in your interviews you got any comments about who are the better Europeans, who are perceived are more valued. If the people that you interviewed had any reflection about it. You already said about A8 and A2, but who are the desired and why? And then the second question is about this racialization. So just like in your research, for instance, in the United States, the Irish, the Italians, Eastern Europeans at the beginning of the 20th century were not considered properly white neither, but they had to gain it to be perceived white, and it took a lot of time. So the question is, when we, the Poles, will be considered, or we, the Romanians, will be considered white, and what is necessary for this to happen and for the discrimination to end? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important points you raised. So on the first one, generally the way that the narratives were about the more desirable people were not so much about Western Europeans, even though I assumed that there was something there, but generally like about English people, so white people in England. And that's how they positioned themselves, and particularly, and this was not only Amelia that said it, but other people said, when they go back home, they feel sort of a distance to being, from Poland, because they're these kind of like British Poles in some ways. But they did not actually speak about who are better. It's almost like a more symbolic thing of just seeing, not necessarily being able to talk about the French or the Spanish, but actually just talking about the Eastern Europeans as not being civilized enough. But who knows who is civilized. In terms of racialization, a couple of people did also talk about the Irish in that context. Like, the Irish also went through this. Some people went to Ireland to work for some time and said we are, quite similar, and there was this connection with the Irish people. And I guess like what you're saying is important, because of course when, even our two participants that are younger, particularly Amelia, she was already, her English is perfect, right? So just by speaking, she's not sort of necessarily recognized as not being British. And so with her children, I mean, this will eventually, it will be easier, like we will be more white as we go through, right? So it is that kind of thing that will shift. And who knows? I mean, I think it's an important question to think about more. Will we ever be properly European?
Alex, you were next on my list.
Thank you so much, Kasia. I really, really enjoyed your talk. Very rich, and I learned so much from it. There was one observation that I wanted to share, which I thought moved me in a way, because I'm teaching a module right now that's called Post-Colonial Europe, and my students and I, we watched Edward Said. There's a video on YouTube, and he says the way Muslims and Orientals are depicted in the media, that was in the late 1990s, has got nothing to do with how I experience, the vast different parts of the world that have been described as the Orient. So he obviously spoke about Palestine. And I thought the way you said these images that I find in the media of Eastern Europe, they have nothing to do with how I how I know Poland. So I thought you put that really nicely. Thanks for that. And that sort of my question draws on this sort of analogy between the way Eastern Europe has been developed as a category. You know, vastly different countries have been grouped into this one category, and which is analogous to Orientalism. But I wonder whether that sometimes pushes us too easily to think about the analogies, because I was struck by the fact that in your quotes, your respondents who showed what you described as solidarity were very often the same people who also espoused quite racist views. So can we, I always get very uneasy with this sort of comparison, you know, when people say my experience is just like the same as Pakistanis would have it in the UK. And I always wonder how we can theorize this. So, you know, I'm going to pass my unease onto you and hope that you have
I think
solution for this.
I have the same unease, and I think many Eastern Europeans who think like decolonially, right? So we start thinking about, okay, how are we experiencing racism? How are we racialized? And then especially engaging with conversations. And I think my colleague Mithilesh is here today. You know, we keep on having these conversations because for people in India, like we are European and we are just as white, right? So for people who are actually working with are from formerly colonized countries, this might not actually have much weight. And we need to be careful with that, and we need to take that into consideration and maybe just accept that it is very messy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, Eastern Europe can't be understood or theorized from a decolonial or post-colonial perspectives, while at the same time really deeply engaging, and colleagues are doing this, deeply engaging with the various tensions. Like in Poland, you know, you have a country that actually had a colonial league that wanted to colonize and made some steps towards that, at the same time as being narrated as, you know, so behind and catching up with the West, right? And then you have things between countries as well, right? So what Hungary was doing and what Poland is doing and what other countries are doing is so different. So it's also the risk about, you know, not seeing the East as one block. And, you know, in events that we have both attended, there has been these conversations, right, about people from the Balkans saying actually Central Eastern Europeans have more privilege, right? They are considered as being closer to the West. And so again, this category of Central Eastern Europeanness that Maria Janjan speaks about as being sort of constructed particularly to distance from Eastern Europe is also really important. And yes, so I share your uncomfort, and I guess this will be a challenge for this scholarship, you know, to kind of tease all these tensions out.
Elena, is it the Elena Genova? There's an Elena who, yes, Elena wanted to ask a question. You said, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Camilla already kind of picked up on that question, but if I may, I'll just ask a quick question, actually. First of all, Kasia, thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really, really interesting. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about these narratives of people coming home and how they're perceived back in Poland. So what are the narratives around that? I'm just kind of wondering and thinking about you know, work around kind of perceptions of, you know, abroad as this kind of the West is the civilized, and, you know, it's better over there. So, you know, how people react to people coming back, even if it's particularly if it's for a short period of time rather than obviously return migration. So what are the narratives around coming back home? And kind of if you could unpack that quote, where it was Amelia from England ultimately. Thank you.
Yes, so Amelia is a bit of a maybe specific case in the sense that she came to this country when she was 7. So I'm thinking that her sort of Englishness is more than the other respondents, in the sense that, you know, she talked about how actually that interview that Kasia did, Kasia is with us today. So Kasia, if you want to talk about that interview more, feel free to jump in. But from what I understand, that interview was in English. So Amelia is more comfortable speaking English, firstly. So I guess her friends back home even if she keeps these relations, sense that. And I related to those experiences because I left Poland when I was 10, and I think my Polish is quite good now, but it wasn't always good when I was kind of coming back as a teenager. And then, it was these things that my respondents also said when people asked you, which language do you think in? Like, where do you feel more at home? And you think, I don't know, I can't really answer that. So that came through a little bit. What also came through in the ways that people thought about home was the political context. So actually a lot of people, I guess maybe it is also specific for the migrants in London. We know that Polish people in London are more in opposition in terms of politics, like the political parties that they support. So they were very critical, saying when they go back, they really find it difficult to talk to people. They really find that like it's, and they were talking about sort of it being backward and it doesn't change and it's just really bad. But then it becoming better and better financially. So the one time that they were able to say something positive about what happens in Poland is that there are more opportunities now for younger people, and there's more of this kind of social welfare politics that are being pushed through from the ruling party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, Law and Justice. That means that people actually can afford housing and they get support for their children. So they were able to say that, but overall it was this kind of feeling alienated because of sort of what goes on in Poland with the racism, the abortion protest is something that they can't relate to really. And so that drove them sort of further away from home.
Laura, you were next.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I thought it resonated very well with the research that I have been involved in. And I was curious to learn more about what your participants did to counter racism when they've encountered it, and also with this feeling, how they coped with the feeling of not feeling at home, basically. Having in mind that many of them had been in the country for quite a long time, as far as I could see. But yeah, you have already commented a little bit on this. So I was just wondering if you had any additional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Laura. So what was a little bit surprising to me in some ways was that, like you said, many have been in England for quite some time. But even when we asked about discrimination that they experienced, the first thing they would say was often there hasn't been any discrimination, and only later would they say there has been one thing. And I didn't include that in the quotes, but the kind of third thing that they would say after that was, you can understand that because, there's so many people coming, they're flooding in. Then they spoke about something that many other people on here have already done research on, about this sense of, I think Eleanor, in one of Eleanor's papers as well, this kind of distance from, the Poles that come and are using, bad language or behaving badly on public transport. And so it was the sense that actually, like, we understand why we are perceived like this and why people are getting upset. We understand they see us as stealing jobs, but we understand why, like we work for, lower wages. And then some of them were more critical, saying, and actually this came out quite a lot, saying, but, if they want us to leave, like, who's going to do their jobs? Like, we know that they're not going to do it themselves. So there was that kind of narrative of maybe explaining it a little bit. But the critical comments that came from Amelia and Richard to some extent were not very common in the 20 interviews that I did. Somehow it was often sort of explaining why it is understandable that there would be hostility towards them. And for your second part of your question about how to deal with the home, that also felt a bit kind of sad, like, because it felt that, okay, we're not wanted here, we don't really belong, we kind of don't know what to do, we might just go back. Or there was kind of this sense of like, not really knowing what to do with yourself, like that. And even for people who have been here for quite some time.
Anya, you were next.
Okay, thank you so much, Kasia, for your talk. I have a combination of a comment and a question, and you can decide what to respond to. But I was really curious about the process of racialization, how racialization happens, how is it negotiated and challenged? Because you have talked about just some people being critical and others maybe less so. But is it seen by the respondents or by you as a constant, or is that something that's related to the system of power and oppression and resources that changes over time, because Brexit changed something. And what's going on in Poland in relation to race and racialization changed something as well. So a question of it as a process rather than a thing in time.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point that I think I should think more about that also when I analyze the data and present it, in the sense of not seeing it as a static thing. Of course, I think that it was different sort of pre-2004. I think that, I mean, Eleanor would know more about this than me, but the migrants that came might have been perceived differently. And then with time, with 2004 and so many people coming at the same time, and then around 2015, when, you know, we elected to government, you know, the media stories in this country around what is happening in Poland, it was largely, you know, negative and critical of many reasons, right? And I think that also that also plays a part in the sense, like, you know, how is Poland constructed to people abroad, and then what does that sort of legitimize almost in terms of narratives, right? And I always struggle with this as a Polish migrant in the West, and have throughout my entire life, when people tell me, you know, how your government is so horrible and your country is so backward. And in my head, I think it is so horrible, like, I hate this government. But at the same time, it's like, if that is the only thing we are hearing, we never hear of the other stories and the kind of the things that have actually progressed, right? The things that have actually, like, progression, not as a linear thing, but the things that have improved, you know, and the conversations that we are having now, like the conversations that people are having in Poland around Black Lives Matter, for example, right? At the same time as, like, completely undermining women's rights. So yeah, I just take your point here about that it's as it changes. And just last thing, colleagues have done a lot of good historical work, you know, back to, like, communist times, and how actually, like, there were solidarities and collaborations between sort of colonized countries and Eastern European countries that challenge that kind of narrative of you know, of what happens now, of that kind of, like, static progress. So I think that's also kind of important to always remember that. And I just want to say, Stefan has had his hand up for quite some time, Eleanor.
Okay, so Stefan, do you want to, we've got several people, we can keep going. If you want to stay, I think we can keep going. We don't have to shut down. So Stefan, if you've had your hand up for a long time.
Yes, well, it's an oldie perspective. Thank you very much indeed, Kasia. I think it was very interesting. But I represent a generation that came to live in London in 1966, and I left for Australia at the end of the 80s. So my experience of that time was almost the opposite of your sample. No sense of frustration, no sense of inferiority, no sense of them and us. However, and that's I suppose the more profound comment, when I look back at the generation that settled after the World War II in the late 40s, then the narrative would always be the same. I think the language was different, and there were no racial undertones, not the way they are expressed now. But the sense of inferiority, that sense of frustration and disappointment was there. And then it disappeared when we essentially became the dominant group. And now it comes back, and it comes back with the vengeance. It's very interesting, something to be probed. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Kasia Volin, you had your, yes. Yeah, hello there.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you for making those webinars available to wider audience. I'm really happy to be involved, even though I'm not in academia. And but I will be always, I have to say, an anthropologist by heart. So I have a comment from, and that actually relates to what Agnieszka and Alex said. So it's a common question, which is maybe a bit more based on some organic or personal perspective, really, in relation to what Kasia was talking about, which I found really, really interesting. So first of all, I want to just mention some event. And I was part of Race and Religion Forum here at Middlesex. And I attended few very interesting talks. And obviously in those talks, I was in minority in terms of where I come from, and also in terms of the color of my skin. Now, I found them really, really interesting, and I could really relate to the talk about racism that was going on. After the event, we had obviously after party, let's say, and I shared with few people I had discussion with some experience of reading a book, and that book is Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I could really, really relate to those experiences, even though I'm not Black. But what was really interesting, and both main characters, man and female, and what was really interesting was that I felt a little bit excluded the moment I mentioned that. Now, my question here is why, because I think it's a problem of belonging and being in between, really. My question is why we're asking when we're finally gonna be white enough. I don't wanna be white enough. I actually want to be included by other people, let's say Black people or Asian people in the conversation, because I probably feel more like them in terms of some experiences. So my question, first of all, is why we wanna be more white or acknowledged to be white, and if it came through those conversations that you, Kasia, had with those Polish people. Thank you.
I just wonder, should we take a couple more questions?
Yep,
because
okay, I can tell you. So we've had Stefan Borja and Magda. I hope I'm pronouncing Borja's name correctly.
It's Voya.
Voya, sorry. Would you like to go next, Voya?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So thanks, Kasia, a lot. Especially, I'm a very new, fresh, off the boat Polish migrant in the UK. So this was very interesting for me to hear. And I was wondering more about the topic of shame that you were kind of touching upon a bit, and especially when it came to language and speaking Polish publicly and so on. Well, I personally, I don't know if that's lucky or not, but I moved to Brighton. And well, I haven't met many Polish people there, but the ones that I've met, you know, they're kind of proud of it and they've never met with any issues. But they've told me that there are a lot of other, like they know people from other cities where they come from and so on, where there was a feeling of shame, especially among younger people, that sometimes they don't admit to where they're from. And, you know, for me, that's just terrible to hear generally, because we should never, I don't think we should be put in a situation like that, but especially when you were discussing the issue of language. So is that a newer thing post-Brexit, or is it a self-imposed thing, or is it because people, you know, people's come and stop speaking Polish, go home and so on, or is it this sense of shame? As generally being from Poland, we tend to be very self-critical, so.
Magda, you also had a question.
Hello. Interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about the interethnic relationships your Polish participants have in Britain. You mentioned, for example, a participant with a Muslim boyfriend, but still having anti-Muslim sentiments. So how participants made sense of these kind of feelings? And so I just wanted to find out more about what kind of relationships, like actual relationships they have, friendships, intimate relationships, whether they get married with people, non-white people in Britain. And also if you have any data on how they feel perceived, not just by white English, what we heard in the presentation, but maybe non-white minorities in Britain. And I would just quickly mention that I am working at the moment on a project on which we interviewed, actually together with Professor Louise Ryan, people who arrived in post-war area, Polish, Caribbean, and Irish. And actually in these interviews, their experiences were quite similar. And without a question, I think Irish and Caribbean migrants in our research seem to experience more racism, but that doesn't mean that the Polish migrants who at the time arrived as refugees did not. So we had people who reported being pushed in front of a bus for being foreigner and having an accent, children who were put in special education classes because they were not English, and so on. So I just wanted to mention this about the research project I am working on now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me just sort of finish with responding to these three comments, and thank you. These are such good comments and questions. So I think Magdalena and Kasia, I think your kind of questions, comments relate a little bit to each other about the sort of shared experiences with other ethnic minorities and why that isn't necessarily a problem. Like, why are we trying to all the time be more white, right? And I think it's a critical comment that is really useful. And I see that in the decolonial scholarship that we're doing, and it's kind of linked to, you know, activism as well, of course. I think by kind of trying to be critical of global coloniality of power, I think we are trying to historically and also now dig through those solidarities, or at least sort of like talk about them and maybe see how we can join in as being like all of us being others of like the Western modernity, but in different ways. So while we can perhaps be able to, you know, share some experiences, at the same time, we need to recognize that, you know, if we are in a space with a Black crowd or like a black group, we also have to, I guess, be willing to admit that we do have white privilege in that space. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't sort of talk with each other as long as we recognize those differences. And I think that kind of links to the question about inter-ethnic relations. So actually a few of the participants had, well, most participants said that they had friends who were from like other groups, who were immigrants or, you know, were sort of brown people, Black people. But at the same time, that didn't necessarily mean that they weren't able to engage in racist narratives, just like everyone. But with the marriage thing and how you're perceived when you are, that I don't know, but I'm really actually interested in that. And I think like a project in the future I would love to do about like mixed marriages and how they are perceived, because I see more and more just anecdotally when I come back from Poland, you know, like on the bus from the airport, like you see much more mixed relationships, mixed kids, something that you didn't see so much before. So there's a whole lot of people that are actually living those lives in mixed marriages that probably have really interesting experiences. In terms of Voya's comment, so I think that the speaking in public is because that is what differentiates us. So we are white, and so if you just look at us, we're not necessarily different like that. But as soon as we open our mouth, like that's when our like inferiority, you know, like comes. Or and you know, again, like when I was growing up in Sweden, I remember my mom, who's not going to admit it, she's not going to admit it now, but she always did tell me like we have to speak quietly, you know, like on public transport. Which I don't know if it would be the case if we were French. I guess not. Like I'm guessing not. But so I think that the shame comes from just the perception. If you are Eastern European, you are seen as this and that, right? And the language is the thing that will differentiate you. So,
just if I can add that shows the difference between what kind of European you are, because I came from Norway as a 7-year-old to Poland, and there was never that feeling of speaking Norwegian quietly on the bus. You know, never even once. So that's very different.
And you know, whenever somebody comes to Poland, right, my husband, who says like after a decade of marriage, he says probably 10 words in Polish, and everybody's like, yes, like you're great, you know, because you can say 10 words, right? I mean, if the reverse was true, people wouldn't be as impressed, right? So yeah, I agree.
Any other questions? I don't think anybody else has got any questions. Any last questions that? I mean, one of the things also was this comparison, as you're saying, that you didn't look at between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans. I wouldn't assume that Western Europeans, like the French or the Germans, because do not have any racism against them. I mean, especially with Germans, the whole point about Brexit, as somebody has pointed out, is who won the war. And that's never, you know, with the British, that has never gone very far. So I'm just saying it might be an interesting, you know, of the complexities of the rings of, as you say, hierarchies of Europeanness. Well, there are other Europeans then that are also in the hierarchy. So.
Camilla has a
hand. I just have one last comment on this interethnic couples and marriages, which you mentioned. I remember reading that a couple of years ago there was this statistics about Polish women giving birth to babies in Britain, and that's this, you know, this number are increasing. And it was comments, some people were commenting on it, like, okay, it's quite opposite in Poland, what is happening? And then the comments were going on and people were commenting that, well, actually these children are not Polish because their fathers are not Polish. So, and that there was this huge discussion about race and interethnic marriages, and there's a lot of racism going on. And actually in my own research, which I did in Brighton, by the way, it made me very happy that Voya, you mentioned Brighton. These interethnic marriages were very, very commented upon, and really very often in very racialized way, very negatively. And so that's why I also asked about gender, because in my experience, it was more often men were quite against it. And I think that they also employed a lot of, you know, strategies protecting themselves from being seen as inferior or racialized as Eastern Europeans, more barbarian type of a man. So that things kind of play out very vividly in my own research. And so that's why I also wanted to say these last few words about this interethnic marriages and how this actually can really steer a heated debate about race. And yeah, thank you.
Kasia, can I just add something to that, which Camilla's point made me think of, which is exactly that of convenience marriages, and how, I mean, as an Italian, I'm seen as marrying into a British family or into a British relationship for convenience. What would be interesting to see is not now, but in the next 5 to 10 years with Brexit, how perhaps the convenience of British citizens marrying into European families, and see how that hierarchy of Europeanness will change because of it. And I'm sure that there will be still, you know, the Germany at the top and everyone at the bottom kind of hierarchy in some way, but it will be interesting to see sort of those dynamics if and how they change. I hadn't thought of it, so thank you Camilla for that.
Okay, so that we've got our next research project, mixed marriages, right? Because actually I had students in the 1990s who were Brazilians, and they wanted to marry Europeans and not the British, because marrying a third country national meant they had the ability to come into UK without, at that time, much more easily. And of course, then with the income requirement, now that's gone with Brexit. So it will be very interesting. Who becomes the privileged marriage partner? For what purpose? Very interesting. Anyhow, it's 2:15. Thank you, everybody, for coming, for the very excellent discussion that we've had. And Kasia, very much, thank you very, very much. And I think you've got those comments also in the chat. We will, as I say, we have recorded it, and we have a YouTube channel, by the way, now on the SPRC. So we will be converting it into YouTube. So if you know of anybody who missed it, they will be able to watch it. So thank you very much, everyone. And of course, to Kasia as the presenter. Thanks a lot.